how to define love, or what would love look like, how you would answer that question. Barbara told me yesterday that we've spent 25 Valentine's days together now. And I can tell you that the way we celebrated Valentine's yesterday looked way different than it did 25 years ago. Because yesterday we spent Valentine's Day driving for 2 hours in a truck just to pick up a pig for one of our kids, eating fast food on the way home. So maybe I'll ask you this then. What is the result of love? What happens when we express love? You know, one of the things that I've found in life, and maybe in the context of the world that we live in today, is that love has become a thing that's really hard to define. And I think as each day goes forward, we have a lot of talking heads that tell us what love looks like or what happens as a result of love, and it gets harder and harder to define. For some people, maybe it's not hard to define, but maybe it's harder to express love, or for some people, maybe difficult to receive love. Last week, we started this little short series called Love Stories, and we took a look at the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. And we found that this account of Adam and Eve teaches us some valuable lessons about marriage. And particularly, the big thing we took away from that is that marriage is a sacred covenant to be kept, not a social construct to be left. But we also found out that marriage has a glorious purpose, because our marriages point people to the relationship that Jesus has with the church. This week, we're going to dive even deeper than we did last week into the book of Ruth. And I told the first group, hey, I'm sorry, it's super, super deep, but we haven't gone this deep for a long time, so I have to make up for some ground, and I'm going to do that this morning. So I want you to turn to the book of Ruth. If you don't know where that's at, it's in the Old Testament. It's after the book of Judges, just before 1 Samuel. And as you're getting to this book, we're going to do a survey through the entire book today. It's 4 chapters long. We're going to go through all 4 chapters, bits and pieces. I won't read the whole thing to you. But as you're getting there to that book, here's some important context, background information that I think is important to know as you read through this book. And I'm going to challenge you, go read the book today. Go read it this week. It's short. You can do it fairly quickly. I actually read through the entire book again this morning before I came up for first service. But after today, when you read through it, man, I think it's going to be very eye-opening. But here's the time period in which this book was written. We're told from the very beginning of the book that it occurs during the period of Judges. And this book serves as a bridge between 2 time periods in Israel's history. You have the period of Judges, and then immediately following Judges, you have the period of the kings in the history of Israel. And Ruth is the bridge between those 2 periods. And the way our Bibles work, the order of the books, is we place the book of Ruth right between Judges and 1 Samuel. Which works from a time period framework. It helps us get from that Judges period to Kings. But in the Hebrew Bible, that's not where the book of Ruth appears in the order of books. The Hebrew Bible orders their books differently. It's called the Tanakh, and each of those is it's an acronym, but it stands for the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's how first 5 books is the law, the Torah. Then you get the prophets, then you get the writings, and Ruth comes in that section of the Hebrew Bible called the writings. In most arrangements of the writings, Ruth comes immediately after the book of Proverbs. And when you read Ruth from that perspective, Proverbs chapter 31 is the last chapter in Proverbs, and the last half of the chapter of Proverbs is all about what a faithful woman or wife looks like. And so those readers of the Hebrew Bible would have read that and went immediately into Ruth, which tells a pretty interesting story that correlates very significantly to Proverbs chapter 31. The book as a whole is what's called a chiasm. And if you don't know what that is, it's think of it as like a V-shaped, the book is written V-shaped. And so the beginning and the end point to the middle of the book, and they correlate. Each section correlates until you get to that middle section. And any time you have that kind of structure, the beginning is the end points, the beginning and the end, and the middle are usually the most important pieces of the story. So the way that the book of Ruth is laid out is in the beginning and the end, the correlating points are a family history. You get a family history in the beginning, a family history in the end. And then as you work your way toward the middle, the next section of correlating stories is about kinship. And in the first part of the book, it's kinship between women. In the second part of the book, it's kinship between men. But then right in the middle, you get the story of Ruth and Boaz, and it's about their relationship. And so the story is working toward the middle of that. It's also been called by some as the female version of the book of Job. So if you haven't read it, here's a spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you how it ends. This is how it starts. It starts with brokenness, bitterness, barrenness, and death. That's the way the story starts. But when you get to the end, after you've worked through all of these progressions, it ends with redemption, restoration, hope, and life, which is fascinating to think about. That this book begins with death and ends with life. It's also important to understand as you read through this that Ruth is an outsider. She's a foreigner. She is not an Israelite. She's a Moabitess. Which, we could go on a rabbit trail on that whole thing. But she's not Jewish. There's a word in this story that's repeated 3 times that I think is extremely important to understand. Because this is also a word that's used by God Himself to describe one of His characteristics, one of His qualities. It is also a word that is used by several Old Testament authors when they speak of God. They use it to describe a specific attribute of God. The word that appears now, Don gave you a Greek lesson this morning. And I want you to understand, Don did some digging. He did some good work on that Greek word. I'm going to give you a lesson in Hebrew. So you're getting Greek and Hebrew this morning. And he told you it feels like seminary. This is what today is. This word that we're going to really clue in on today in Ruth is the Hebrew word chesed. Okay? And it's translated various ways into English. But here's an example of how chesed was used by God Himself. So this is God describing Himself to Moses. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, it says, "And as He passed by," as God passed in front of Moses, this is what He was proclaiming: the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love." That's the Hebrew word chesed, and faithfulness. The English Standard Version, so NIV translates chesed, love, in this situation. The English Standard Version translates this word into steadfast love. And the New American Standard Bible creates a whole new word in English to translate this word, and it's loving kindness. So they take 2 English words and smash them together to translate this word chesed. In Psalm 36, verse 5, the verse says, "Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens." That's your chesed. And in Psalm 136, every time the word love is used, it's that word chesed. When we get to Ruth, we find this word in chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 20, and chapter 3, verse 10. And for whatever reason, the New International Version, the NIV, chooses the English word kindness. Not love, not steadfast love, not loving kindness, but they choose the word kindness. But I think really the translators may have missed the mark a little bit, because it really is it's a book that is saturated with this kind of love. It's a love that I'm going to call loyal love. It's saturated with examples of a kind of love that I feel like is desperately needed in our world today. All right. So I'm going to tell you the story of Ruth in a nutshell. I'm going to give you my version. So we start this book off, and we learn about this woman named Naomi. Naomi was married to a man named Elimelech. Elimelech and Naomi have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They live in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. Elimelech and Naomi decide that they have to leave the house of bread because there is no bread. There's a famine. They're hungry. They need food. So they leave and they travel to a place called Moab. It's a foreign country. It's not part of Israel. Actually, the Israelites considered them enemies. When they get to Moab, they're there for about 10 years. And in the span of 10 years, Elimelech dies. Her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they marry Moabite women. They marry a woman named Ruth and a woman named Orpah. But also in the span of that 10 years, Naomi's children have no children, and her sons die. So this puts Naomi in a very perilous situation in the ancient world. She is a widow with no children and no grandchildren, and she really has no hope of being remarried. So what typically happened to women in the ancient world in this situation is two outcomes. They're either sold into slavery or they're forced to become prostitutes. So Naomi decides that it would be better for her to die in Israel, back home in Bethlehem, than it would be to die in this foreign country of Moab. So she says she's going back. I'm going back to Bethlehem. And she tells her daughter-in-laws, who are also widows now at this point, go back home. Go to your mother's house and perhaps try to find a husband that will take care of you so you don't face the same despair that I'm facing. Naomi calls her, she says this situation is bitter. Now, her name means pleasant. But I want to pick up at chapter 1, verse 8, where we find our first occurrence of this concept of loyal love, chesed. Chapter 1, verse 8. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you chesed, kindness, that loyal love, as you have shown kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Now, there's a lot going on here. Naomi is saying, listen, I know the Levirate law says that if I had more sons, their duty would be to marry you to carry on the family name. But I have no more sons, and I'm too old to have any more, and by the time you waited for those sons, you would be too old. There's no hope. Go find somebody else. And Orpah says, okay, I'm out. I'm going back home. But Ruth says, no, I'm going to stick with you. And as a matter of fact, the word that's used, it says that Ruth clung to Naomi. It's the exact same word that we talked about last week in Genesis chapter 2:24, when it says a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. It's the same word. And so we see Ruth clinging to her mother-in-law who is widowed. And then we get to probably the most recognized verses in all of the book of Ruth, in chapter 1, verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So what happens from this point in the story is Naomi realizes she is sticking with me. She is in this with me, and they return back to Bethlehem. When they get back to Bethlehem, Ruth goes out to the barley fields. It's barley harvest. It's that time of year. The farmers are bringing in the barley, and Ruth goes out to gather from the edges of the field the barley that's left behind. This is another Levirate law thing. They were commanded, when you harvest your fields, leave the edges of the field and whatever falls on the ground, leave it there for the poor, the destitute to come and be able to gather and have food. So Ruth goes out and she starts gleaning in the fields this barley to take home to feed her and Naomi. She ends up, if there's a word in the Bible that is translated coincidentally, this is a word that's very close. But the text says, "as it turns out," but it's really kind of providential. It says, "As it turns out, she ends up in the field of a man named Boaz." And Boaz notices her. So she goes back to Ruth that night after gleaning from the fields, taking the barley with her. And Naomi says, "Hey, where have you been gleaning today?" And Ruth says, "I've been in the field of a man named Boaz." And Naomi says, that's great. Boaz is a family member. He's related to Elimelech, the dead father-in-law. Now, this is a huge piece of the story because Boaz becomes what's known as the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. It's another Levirate law which required the closest relative of a person that was in dire straits, a person that was poor, destitute, and had no hope. The law required that the closest relative make sure that they had what they needed in life. It would include buying their property if necessary. And Ruth catches this guy's attention. And Boaz is very generous to Ruth. As a matter of fact, he encourages her, don't go glean in anybody else's field. Don't go harvest in any other field. Follow my workers around, and the women that are working for me, stay with them. And he even commanded his workers, don't touch her, don't harm her. See, he recognized that Ruth was in a bad situation because she was a foreign widow. She was at a lot of risk. And Boaz shows her extreme chesed. So we get back to the house. And this conversation between Ruth and Naomi is taking place. And Naomi makes this statement, which is very fascinating. Chapter 2, verse 20. So skip ahead. Here's where we're at. Chapter 2, verse 20. After this conversation, where you been? Well, I've been at Boaz's field. Naomi says this, "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness, chesed, to the living and to the dead." And she added, "This man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers," the Goel. Now, in English, when we read this, we say, well, Naomi is describing Boaz. The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing kindness, chesed. And in English, it makes perfect sense, but in Hebrew, that is not the case at all. In Hebrew, it is ambiguous. We don't know if Naomi is talking about Boaz showing chesed or God showing chesed. It could be translated in Hebrew either way. And I think the author leaves it ambiguous for a reason. I think it's both. I think Naomi is talking about both the Lord and Boaz. Because what we see here is that the Lord's loyal love is being seen and extended through the loyal love of Boaz. When you read the story, you'll find just how loving Boaz becomes. So up to this point in the story, we have seen that Ruth demonstrates loyal love in her own life toward her mother-in-law, her widowed mother-in-law. Now we see that Boaz is a character that demonstrates loyal love to Ruth. But when we begin chapter 3, we're introduced to another character, well, not a new character, but we're introduced to Naomi, who is now showing the same kind of loyal love. So chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." So Naomi's like, forget about me. Don't worry about me. Now let's focus on you. I want to make sure that everything's okay for you when I die. She is being so selfless at this point. She is generously looking for a way for Ruth to be cared for after she's gone. So at this point in the story, this is where things get a little even weirder. They devise a plan. Naomi and Ruth sit there, and Naomi says, "Hey, I have a plan. This is what we're going to do." Now, when you go back home today and later this week and you read it, you're going to say, okay, now I know what he was talking about. Bonnie was very familiar with the story this morning, and she knew exactly what I was talking about. But here's the plan. Naomi tells Ruth, "I want you to go to the threshing floor. Boaz is going to be there. Matter of fact, he's going to be there all night. He's going to fall asleep, and he's going to sleep there, and it's kind of like guarding the grain, right? He's guarding the grain. He's going to go to sleep there tonight. I want you to wait until he's asleep, and when he's asleep, I want you to go in and uncover his feet." All right, Brandon, try that. Uncover. This is what she says. Go uncover Boaz's feet. Now, that's another long path we could go down. It's very cool. And it actually kind of relates to what Seth said about Isaiah 6 a little bit. But Ruth is like, okay, I'll do it. I will do it. She goes to the threshing floor. And when Boaz goes to sleep, she goes in and she uncovers his feet and lays at his feet. We're told that he was startled in the middle of the night and he says, "Hey, who's there?" And this is Ruth's reply in chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. "Hey, who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. Now, I want you to be ready here to pin this verse. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness," here's that word chesed again, "this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." Now, what is happening here essentially is Ruth is asking Boaz to marry her. She's the one that's taken the bull by the horns, and she's saying, "Marry me." But I want to pause for just a moment because I think there's something very interesting that we got to pull out here that helps us make some connections. I told you to pin that verse or mark that verse. She said, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." Now, what's happening here is this is a play on something that Boaz said earlier in the story. So go back to chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Now, this is Boaz speaking. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before." Now, watch what he says next. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now that word, "under whose wings," the word wings, is the same exact Hebrew word where she says, "Spread the corner." She says, "Spread the wing of your garment over me." See, what Ruth recognized is that taking refuge under the wing of the Lord was experienced through Boaz covering her with his wing. She realizes, like, if I want to experience the refuge, the love of God, it comes through Boaz's love and refuge for me. And so we get to this part in the love story and everything sounds great. It's like, yes, true love. Boaz is going to rescue Ruth, but not so fast. Because Boaz says, "Wait a minute, Ruth, there's one problem. There's a relative that's actually closer than me. And legally, he has the right to redeem before me. So, before anybody sees in the morning, Ruth's allowed to return home. Now, in this section of the story, there are so many flashbacks to the other stories in the Old Testament. Like these readers' minds would have been thinking about Lot. They would have been thinking about Noah. Because Boaz has an opportunity to take advantage of Ruth. He has an opportunity to do things that we were like, man, readers of the Old Testament would have been thinking Boaz probably would have seduced Ruth that night. But Boaz is noble. And he says, hey, and there's even one closer than me. So Ruth goes back home to Naomi and she says, this is what happened. He says there's somebody that's closer. And Naomi says, don't worry. He will not rest until he gets this situation solved today. And so the very next day, Boaz goes and he meets at the city gates. And if you read Proverbs 31, you'll find that this is where a husband is waiting for his wife. He is at the city gates and he takes 10 elders. And as the closer relative comes by, he says, hey, we got to come over here. You got to come over and talk. Because you're the closest relative to buy Elimelech's land and redeem Naomi. And to purchase the land. And he says, oh yeah, I'll do that. I'll buy the land. I'll do it. And so we're kind of like, oh man, the good guy loses. Boaz doesn't get his woman. But then Boaz is saying, he says, wait a minute. Before you make the deal, realize that when you buy Elimelech's land, you also acquire Ruth as a wife. And then we're told the guy's like, no, I'm not doing that because that puts my estate in jeopardy. What you really need to understand is the guy says, I'm not marrying a Moabite. That's really what he's saying. I'm not marrying a Moabite. And so Boaz says, I'll do it. And to the 10 elders, he says, you're going to be my witnesses. And then they do something else that's crazy. Like he takes the other guy's sandal as a form of a legal binding agreement. So Boaz steps up. He purchases Elimelech's land. He takes Ruth as a wife. And now we're going to speed the process up. Boaz and Ruth have a child. And Naomi rejoices. Now, I told the first group this would make an excellent Hallmark movie. Like if somebody scripted this out, there's so many plot twists and turns, but in the end, it's like the yes. And at first glance, it looks like a great love story. A young widow forsakes the opportunity to remarry in her own homeland just so she can take care of her widowed mother-in-law. This young widow finds a man that's going to take care of her and her mother-in-law. But the reality is the story goes so much deeper than the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. It goes so much deeper than the relationship of Ruth and Boaz. Remember, I told you the book starts with the family history and ends with the family history. Now, this is another interesting fact about the book of Ruth. It ends with the genealogy. Most genealogies, when you get to them in the Bible, they're near the beginning of the book. Think about Matthew and Luke. Genealogies at the beginning. Genesis, genealogy is close to the beginning. But Ruth is different. There's a genealogy at the end. And this genealogy is extremely important in helping us understand the depth of this story. So go to Ruth chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 18 through 22. This is the genealogy. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Now, remember, this is a bridge between the judges and the kings. And so this genealogy points to David, who really becomes thought of as the hope of Israel. But I want you to know that we are in a position that's much different than this original audience. This original audience wouldn't have had the rest of the story. Because we can take this genealogy, and if you go to Matthew, the beginning of Matthew, you find a genealogy that includes this exact lineage, but it leads to Jesus. Jesus can be traced back to David, Jesse, Obed, Boaz. It's a story that started with brokenness. It started with grief. It started with death for Naomi and Ruth. But when you know the story of Israel as a whole, the period of Judges, then you also know that this was the case for Israel as well, as a whole. It was a chaotic, dark period of Israel's history. This was a period of Israel's history when they were in a downward spiral, getting further and further and further from God. But here, at the end of the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, we see the much larger story of God's love for his people. Through their story of brokenness and redemption, he is providing a love that redeems and restores his people. The book of Ruth really reminds me of the Japanese art of kintsugi. I would encourage you to look that up, Google it, and look at the images that pop up with kintsugi. It's basically the art of taking pottery that has been broken and mending it back together. So it'll take the broken pieces, and then they take like an adhesive or a lacquer and put it between all the joints, and then they sprinkle gold dust on those joints and mold it back together. And what's left is a beautiful work of art. Something beautiful from something broken. Now remember, I told you this was a deep dive, and at the end I would get to something that hopefully makes sense. Here's what it is. The love of God is so profound that when imperfect, broken people pursue it, God uses them to fulfill his ultimate purpose. The love of God is so profound that when imperfect, broken people pursue it, God uses them to fulfill his ultimate purpose. Listen, Boaz, Ruth, Naomi, they're noble characters, but they're not perfect characters. They don't do everything right. Like, if Naomi's sons were following the law, they would have never married a Moabitess. And it doesn't really make sense in the story that a Moabite, a Gentile, finds herself in the lineage of Jesus. God uses imperfect, broken people. That's how profound God's love is. And then, Jesus himself tells us that greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And so every week when we gather around this table, that is the profound love that we are celebrating. A love of God that is so profound that there is a word that describes it, that there are so many English words that try to capture it, they can't capture the full meaning. And that's the kind of love that God shows us. That's the kind of love that God invites us to participate in. And when we put this kind of love into practice in our own life, we are participating in his grand plan. He will use the way that we love to point to his greater love. And that's why we celebrate the Lord's Supper. It's not a time to mourn, it's a time to celebrate. It's a celebration of a profound love that's so deep we can't wrap our minds around it. A love that's so profound that he can use broken people like us, take us to restoration, restore hope, and use us for his purpose. So I want to invite you to take this meal together today. We'll do it like normal, from back to the front, come down this way, exit that way. But I want to give you this caution, and I gave it to the first group as well. if you haven't come to receive this kind of love from God, if you haven't received this profound love through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, this meal means nothing. It's just bread and it's just juice. That's all it is. But for those of us who have said we want to receive that profound love, this is life. We should find ourselves in this story. We should find ourselves as the people that were once dead and have been brought back to life because of the love of God. And that's what we celebrate together this morning. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for loving us in a way that is hard for us to understand. Thank you for loving us despite our imperfections, despite our brokenness. And thank you for giving us hope through countless stories of how your love is manifested throughout history. I pray that as we enter this time together, we would celebrate that love, but also reflect and ask ourselves how we can display that same kind of love in our own lives. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.